Welcome to Learn the Sword. It is almost the end of summer. This is the beginning of August. Through this whole summer, we probably practiced the sword a lot. I surely practiced. I put in thousands and pound thousands of strokes. Although sometimes when we practice sword or out of sword, any other sports over the summer, we get injuries. And a lot of times when we get those injuries, we quit practicing those sports until we're healed up. As a general rule, even with a sword, if you get an injury, you pull back a little bit. The problem arises is when you pull back far enough is where you don't do it anymore, or you almost have to start over again. It isn't like getting on a bicycle and riding it again. What I'd like to suggest is if you're using a long sword, for example, and you have an injury and it hurts your right shoulder, your left shoulder, or leg, whatever it is, pull back a little bit, don't stop completely, and adjust your training patterns. For example, this last summer, about July 5th or 6th, I was over in Las Vegas, over at the Martial Arts Super Show. There's about 2,200 martial arts school owners there. Of course, we sparred lots of people, and during that time, I got a slight injury. It was, what would we call this, dislocated little finger. Well, let me tell you, a dislocated little finger doesn't hurt that day. But a couple of days down the road, you can't really hold a sword that well. A matter of fact, you can't do all the gripping you can. You can't swing the sword really hard. Well, let's pull back on that a little bit. Swinging the sword hard and fast is good a couple of times, but as a general rule, during your training, the best thing to do is set up hard and fast, and then execute the cut a little slower, a little smoother. Therefore, you won't put pressure on your arms and shoulders where you don't need it at that time. A lot of students just go at it 100%, which is really good. The problem arises is when you go 100% when you only need to go 40, because we have to work on the nuances, the subtleties, and of course, all the intricacies of the sword. Now, for example, if you have a long sword and you're practicing with it, and you get an injury because you're working in the garden and you cut your finger. Well, I can't use my left hand, you say. Well, what can you do? Well, you put down the long sword, you come on over, and you get a shorter sword. It makes it that simple. So instead of using a longer sword with two hands, go back to a shorter sword, for example, and if your left hand is injured, just start using your right hand and making sure that all your patterns are correct. So when you can go back and forth, even when you have an injury, but don't stop your training and just adjust it. Therefore, when you adjust things with the different swords, the short sword or the long sword, you can see that through injuries and just adjusting the weight of your body, adjusting the action of the sword, you can do a lot of training even though it can become painful. Now, here's what I want you to take in consideration. Say that you don't have a short sword or you don't want to work with it anymore because your injury is getting a little better, but you don't want to pull out your arm again. You know, a lot of times when you have an injury, you re-injure yourself. This injury could have been in a car wreck. It doesn't matter. Someone hits you from behind, you hurt your neck and your back, and then all of a sudden when you're swinging the sword, something kicks in and you get a sore shoulder 6 months down the road. You don't want to work that way. So a lot of times people take the longer sword, instead of pulling it over their head and doing jodan strikes and full big strikes, they stay in a hostile position so they don't hurt their shoulders as much. If you don't raise them up, they won't hurt, they won't move as much. And still, if I raise from here and I cast out, compared to here in a hostile position and cast out, there isn't that much of a difference. I mean, there's a difference, but not that much of a difference where you have to force yourself to receive pain through the injury you got somewhere else. Now, here's what I want you to take in consideration. If you have an injury in your arm and your shoulder and your back, and you're taking your sword and you're throwing it out like this and you're throwing it out like that and it hurts, Make it a little tighter. Make sure your elbow and your shoulder and wrist are tight into your body, and you adjust the angles of the cut a little differently. So instead of taking the sword and throwing it out like that, you have it in here. Make sure this is in, and you throw it out this way. You throw it out this way, and you feel like you can't get out there and reach the target. But then again, you are practicing a long and short sword with one arm, so you have to make adjustments for the physics. It's that simple. So back on point again. No matter what injury you have, leg injury, chest injury, back injury, arm, even as small as a little finger, I want you to take and adjust and work with the sword on the other areas that aren't injured. If your right hand is injured, use your left hand. If your left hand is injured, use your right hand. If you can't stand up, sit down on a stool, like you're at a bar stool with your butt sort of halfway on the stool, and practice drawing that way if you can't stay in a maintained stance. So there's lots of ways you can adjust this. Just remember, practice, practice, and more practice.